Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Shadow Archives. I know many of you listen to these stories to relax and slowly fall asleep. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. If you enjoy these stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's begin. Just a few months ago, I had one of the most disturbing experiences of my life. I still don't know whether to call it a dream, a nightmare, or something that crossed into reality for a few moments. I've had bad dreams before, like everyone does, but this was different. This one didn't fade when I woke up. Parts of it still feel sharp, like they happened yesterday, and sometimes I catch myself thinking about it out of nowhere, wondering what it meant or if it meant anything at all. It started with me being asleep, but aware in a way that didn't feel normal. I wasn't dreaming in the usual sense where things jump around or don't make sense. Everything felt heavy and deliberate. I found myself in a very dark place, not pitch black, but dim, like a world where light existed only enough to show shapes and movement. There were people all around me, moving slowly, wandering in different directions. I could tell they were people by their bodies and the way they walked, but I couldn't see any of their faces. At first, I thought maybe their faces were gone or damaged, but the more I looked, the more I realized that wasn't it. It felt like their faces were hidden, covered, like they were wearing hats, hoods, or something that blocked their features completely. I couldn't make out eyes, mouths, expressions, nothing. That alone made me uneasy. But what really got to me was how normal it felt to them. They weren't panicking. They weren't reacting to me. They were just there, roaming, existing. Then I heard a voice. I never saw where it came from. It wasn't behind me or in front of me. It felt like it was everywhere at once, like it was speaking directly into my head, rather than through the air. The voice was calm, almost instructional, like someone explaining rules to something I should have already known. It told me that there were two worlds. One was the world of the living, the one I knew. The other was the world of the dead. I remember even in the moment thinking, this sounds like that movie Coco, but the feeling was completely different. There was nothing warm or colorful about this place, nothing comforting. The voice explained that most people never crossed between the two worlds. They lived, they died, and that was it. But there were rare people who acted as bridges, and somehow, for reasons it didn't fully explain, I was one of them. According to the voice, every time I fell asleep, a dead person's soul would pass through me. I was like a door or a tunnel. The soul would enter me, move through me, and cross into the world of the living to be born again. Reincarnation, basically. But the terrifying part was that I had never been aware of it. It had been happening without my consent, without my knowledge. I had been used as a portal over and over again, without ever realizing it. As the voice explained this, I started to feel a deep panic building in my chest. I didn't want this. I didn't ask for this. The idea that something could use my body, my existence, without me knowing, made me feel sick. I tried to move, to step back, to do anything, but I couldn't. I was stuck where I was, listening. Then the voice changed slightly, not in tone, but in urgency. It told me that there was now a very important soul waiting, a man's soul. This soul needed to cross into the living world to complete a very important task. The voice didn't say exactly what the task was, but I knew instinctively that it wasn't good. I had a horrible feeling in my gut, the kind you get when you know something bad is coming, but you don't know how to stop it. The voice said that it had to be me, that I was the only one who could allow this soul to pass. But it also said something worse. It said that it would be easier if I consented, if I agreed to let the soul possess me. If I didn't consent, the soul would still come through, but it would be forced. And that would be much worse for me. That's when I completely lost it. I started panicking, screaming, begging, saying no over and over again. I didn't care about rules or destiny or whatever this voice thought I was. I didn't want anyone inside me. I didn't want to be a bridge. I didn't want any part of this. And then I saw him. The man the voice had been talking about appeared in front of me. He stood out immediately from the others. He wasn't wandering aimlessly. He was focused, walking directly toward me. He was a semi-tan man, middle-aged, dressed like someone who worked in an office. He wore a white button-up shirt, the kind that's neatly pressed, fancy pants that middle-aged men wear to work, light brown shoes. Everything about him looked ordinary, almost boring, except for the fact that his face was covered by a hat. I couldn't see his eyes. I couldn't see his expression. Behind him, a woman followed at a distance. I don't know who she was or what her role was, but her presence made everything feel heavier, like witnesses were gathering. The voice kept asking for my consent over and over again. Each time it asked, I screamed no. I screamed it with everything I had. I felt like if I stopped screaming, even for a second, something terrible would happen. The man kept walking closer, slowly, steadily, like he knew time was on his side. At that point, something strange happened. I started to wake up. I could see my room, not the dark place anymore, but my actual bedroom, the walls, the ceiling, the familiar shapes. I thought it was over. I thought I had escaped the dream. But then I realized something horrifying. The man was still there. Even though I was awake enough to see my room, he was still walking toward me, not in the dream world anymore, but somehow overlapping with reality. He moved faster now, like he knew I was slipping away. I was fully conscious. I knew where I was. I knew I was in my bed, and I knew with absolute certainty that I did not want him anywhere near me. I tried to move. I couldn't. I tried to scream. Nothing came out. Just as he got closer, just as I felt like he was about to reach me, everything went black again. I was knocked back into sleep like someone had flipped a switch. When I woke up again, it felt different. This time, I was clearly awake. I could see my room perfectly. Nothing was distorted. Nothing looked dreamlike. I could hear the normal sounds of the morning. Chickens outside doing what they always do at that time. The TV on in the other room. My mom moving around, making breakfast. Everything was exactly as it should have been, but my body wouldn't move. I tried to open my eyes fully, but I couldn't. I could only manage to open the corner of my right eye. The rest of me felt completely paralyzed, like I was trapped inside myself. I knew about sleep paralysis, and part of me tried to tell myself that's what this was. But then I saw something that destroyed that sense of logic completely. Out of the corner of my half-open eye, I saw my body, or at least part of it. Half of my body was lifted off the bed, not floating gently but being pulled, like someone had grabbed my legs and was trying to drag me away. My upper body was still on the mattress, but my lower half was raised, tilted, wrong. Panic surged through me instantly. I knew without any doubt that it was him, the same man, the one who wanted to possess me, the one who didn't care that I had said no. I felt completely helpless. Then suddenly my feet were lowered back onto the bed, not dropped, not slammed, gently placed down like someone reconsidered at the last second. And just like that, I was knocked out again, pulled back into unconsciousness before I could understand what was happening. When I woke up after that, everything was normal. I could move, I could sit up, I could breathe properly. The room was quiet except for the usual sounds. There was no man, no voice, no dark world, just my bedroom exactly as it always was. That was the last time I experienced anything like that. I don't know what it was. I don't know if it was a nightmare mixed with sleep paralysis, my brain creating something terrifying out of stress or exhaustion. I don't know if it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the way it blended into reality, The way I could hear real sounds while seeing something impossible is what still messes with me. Sometimes I catch myself wondering about that man, if he ever found another bridge, if he ever crossed over, if he's out there somewhere, living again, doing whatever that important deed was supposed to be. I don't know if I believe in any of that. I don't know if I want to. All I know is that for a few moments, it felt real enough to change the way I think about sleep, about consciousness, about how thin the line between dreams and reality can feel when your brain decides to cross it. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm drifting off, I still remember the voice, asking for my consent, and I'm still saying no. This happened one night that I still think about more often than I'd like to admit. It wasn't dramatic in the moment, and there was nothing obviously supernatural about it, but the more I replay it in my head, the more uncomfortable it becomes. It's one of those experiences that didn't fully sink in until afterward, when the evidence was right in front of me and there was no easy explanation left. It was late in the evening, and a thunderstorm had rolled in that was far worse than anything we were used to. I've lived through plenty of storms in my life, but this one stood out immediately. The rain was coming down hard, not just steady but violent, the kind that sounds like gravel being thrown against the house. The wind was even worse. The gusts were strong enough to make the whole house groan and creak, and every now and then the windows would rattle like they were about to pop out of their frames. At the time, I was upstairs with my girlfriend and our 4-year-old daughter. We were going through our usual bedtime routine, trying to keep things calm and normal despite the storm outside. Our daughter was already a little on edge because of the thunder. Each loud crack of lightning made her flinch, and we were doing our best to reassure her that everything was okay. Storms like that can feel enormous and overwhelming when you're that young. That's when I first heard the noise. At first, it blended in with the storm. There was so much chaos outside that it took a moment for my brain to register that something sounded different. It was a loud banging or slamming sound coming from downstairs. Not a single bang, but repeated, heavy impacts. The sound was deep and solid, like something large hitting the house with force. I paused for a moment, listening. The storm was still raging, the wind howling, thunder rolling overhead. My first thought was that it had to be something related to the weather. Maybe a large tree branch had broken off and was slamming against the side of the house. Maybe a piece of siding had come loose and was flapping wildly in the wind. Those things happen during storms, especially ones this intense. The banging continued. It wasn't random. It had a rhythm to it, though not a steady one. Bang, pause, bang, bang, pause, bang. It wasn't constant, but it was persistent. Each time it happened, it echoed through the house, loud enough that there was no mistaking it for something small. My girlfriend noticed it too. She asked me what that noise was, her voice tight with concern. I told her it was probably just the storm. I didn't want to scare her or our daughter by jumping to conclusions. At that moment, the storm was a perfectly reasonable explanation. The wind was strong enough to do just about anything. Still, I couldn't help but feel uneasy. The banging went on for what felt like a long time. I didn't time it exactly, but later, thinking back, I realized it had to have lasted around 15 minutes. 15 minutes of loud, heavy impacts against the downstairs area of the house, long enough that it stopped being something I could easily ignore. I considered going downstairs to check it out, but then another gust of wind would hit, or a crack of thunder would shake the house, and I'd talk myself out of it. I didn't want to leave my girlfriend and daughter upstairs alone during a storm like that. I also didn't want to open any doors or windows while the weather was so bad. The idea of stepping into that chaos didn't seem smart, so I stayed upstairs. I listened. I tried to rationalize it. Eventually, the banging stopped. There was no dramatic ending to it, no final crash or splintering sound. It just stopped. The storm continued for a while longer, but the heavy slamming noise didn't come back. I remember feeling a strange sense of relief, like whatever had been causing it had finally torn free and blown away into the night. That explanation made sense to me at the time. A loose branch finally breaking off, a piece of siding ripping away, something like that. Storms can be destructive, and it wouldn't have been the first time something on a house got damaged during extreme weather. We finished getting our daughter ready for bed. Eventually, the storm eased up enough that the thunder grew more distant and the wind calmed down. The rest of the night passed without incident. I didn't go downstairs to check anything before bed. I figured I'd deal with it in the morning when it was light out and safe to see what kind of mess the storm had left behind. I slept, but not particularly well. The next morning, the storm was gone. The sky was overcast, the ground soaked, but everything felt quiet again. That eerie calm that sometimes follows a violent storm. After breakfast, I decided to go outside and inspect the house. I wanted to see what had caused all that noise and what kind of damage we were dealing with. I walked around the yard first. I expected to see fallen branches, maybe a broken fence panel, something obvious. There were a few smaller branches scattered around, but nothing that looked big enough to have caused that kind of banging for that long. The siding on the house looked intact. Nothing appeared loose or damaged from what I could see. That's when I went around to the back of the house. As soon as I saw the back door, my stomach dropped. There were large, muddy boot prints right on the door. Not on the ground near it, but on the door itself. Specifically around the handle area. The mud was smeared and thick, clearly left by someone wearing heavy boots. These weren't small footprints. They were big, the kind you'd expect from a grown adult. And they were placed in a way that suggested someone had been standing there, bracing themselves, pushing or kicking at the door. I just stood there for a moment, staring at them. The realization hit me all at once. That banging I had heard during the storm hadn't been a tree branch or loose siding. It had been someone trying to get into my house. The thought made my skin crawl. The storm suddenly took on a whole new meaning. The heavy rain, the wind, the thunder. It had all provided perfect cover. The noise of the weather would have masked the sound of someone banging on a door. The darkness and chaos would have made it harder to notice anything unusual. Whoever it was had chosen the perfect time. I looked more closely at the door. The boot prints were clustered around the handle, as if the person had been trying to force it open. There were marks where mud had been pressed into the surface, suggesting repeated attempts. Kicks, shoves, maybe even trying to shoulder the door. That's when I felt a wave of gratitude mixed with fear. Our back door was heavy, very heavy. It was reinforced, solid, built to withstand force. At the time we installed it, I hadn't thought much about why we needed something so strong. It just seemed like a good idea. Standing there that morning, looking at those muddy prints, I realized just how important that door had been. If it had been weaker, if it had given way, someone would have gotten inside. Inside the house where my girlfriend and my 4-year-old daughter were sleeping upstairs. The thought made me feel sick. I replayed the night in my head over and over. The length of time the banging lasted, the way it stopped suddenly. Had the person given up? Had they heard something that scared them off? Or had they simply realized the door wasn't going to open and decided to leave? I also thought about how close I had been to going downstairs to check the noise. What if I had opened the door? What if I had confronted whoever was out there, alone, in the middle of a violent storm? The possibilities spiraled in my mind, each one worse than the last. What scared me most was how calm I had been during the storm, how easily I had explained it away, how normal it had seemed in the moment. If the storm hadn't been so loud, If the banging had happened on a quiet night, I would have immediately known something was wrong. But under those conditions, it blended in just enough to be dismissed. I cleaned the mud off the door, but the image of those boot prints stayed with me. Even now, I can picture exactly where they were, how they looked, how real and undeniable they were. There was no mystery about whether someone had been there. Someone absolutely had. I never found out who it was or why they were trying to get in. Maybe it was someone looking for shelter. Maybe it was someone with much worse intentions. I'll never know, and in a way, that uncertainty is the hardest part. What I do know is that the storm that night wasn't the scariest thing happening. The wind and thunder were just noise. The real danger was quiet, determined, and standing right outside my back door, hidden by the rain. I go to Michigan State University, and for a while, I worked in one of the bakeries on campus. It was just a normal student job, early mornings, the smell of bread and sugar, and the kind of routine work you do half asleep while thinking about classes or going back to bed. Like most campus jobs, it came with a lot of quiet talk. People shared rumors, strange stories, and bits of campus history that never made it into official tours or brochures. Most of it was harmless. Some of it sounded exaggerated, and then there were a few stories that everyone spoke about in a lower voice, the kind you could tell weren't jokes. This is one of those stories. When I first heard it, I didn't know what to think. It sounded too dark, too messed up to be real. But the more time I spent on campus, and especially after I changed jobs, I realized there was truth behind it. Not just truth, but physical proof that something awful had happened. The story starts with a student who used to attend the university. I never learned his name, and honestly, no one ever seemed to say it out loud. He was a kid like any other at first. He enrolled, lived in the dorms, went to classes. Somewhere along the way, things went wrong. I don't know the details, and nobody ever claimed to know them for sure. Some people said academic issues, others said behavioral problems. Some hinted at mental health struggles. Whatever the reason, he was eventually kicked out of the university. Getting kicked out didn't just mean he lost his student status. It meant he lost housing, too. Suddenly, he didn't have a dorm room anymore. He didn't have a place to stay. From what I was told, he didn't really have anywhere else to go. He became homeless, drifting around campus and nearby areas, trying to stay out of sight. At first, he survived by squatting in different places: dormitory halls, storage rooms, empty lounges, anywhere he could slip into unnoticed. College campuses are big, and at night, especially, there are corners that don't see much traffic. He learned the rhythms of the buildings, when people were around, when they weren't, when doors were locked, when they weren't. He learned how to exist without being seen. Apparently, he did this for a long time. Eventually, one of the cafeterias inside a dormitory hall was shut down. It wasn't permanent, just closed for a long period. Renovations, budget issues, staffing problems, something like that. When it closed, the space became quiet. No students coming in and out, no staff, no food service, just a large empty cafeteria sitting unused inside a building that was still otherwise active. That's when he moved in. From what I was told, he lived there for close to a year. A full year, hidden inside a cafeteria in a dorm hall. It sounds impossible when you first hear it, but when you think about how big campus buildings are, how many rooms there are that people rarely enter, it starts to feel disturbingly plausible. He had found a way to survive there without being noticed, and the most unsettling detail of all was where he slept. He slept in the freezer. Not every night maybe, but often enough that it became his main place. The freezer was large, industrial-sized, meant to store food for hundreds of students. When the cafeteria was shut down, the power was off. The freezer wasn't running. It was just a cold metal box, insulated, dark, quiet. To him, it probably felt safe, hidden. a place where no one would think to look. I try to imagine what that must have been like, crawling into a freezer to sleep, the smell of metal and old food, the darkness, the silence, the cold, even when it wasn't running. It's hard to wrap your head around the level of desperation it takes to choose that as a place to rest. For a long time, nothing happened. The cafeteria stayed closed. He stayed hidden. Maintenance workers came and went in other parts of the building, but apparently no one had any reason to open that freezer or even think about it. He existed in the cracks of the system, unnoticed. Then the university decided to reopen the cafeteria. When that decision was made, things started moving quickly. Maintenance crews were sent in to prepare the space. Equipment was brought in, supplies, furniture. Everything that had been removed or stored elsewhere was coming back. It was just another job to them, another space to get ready. One night, a group of maintenance workers moved a large amount of equipment into the cafeteria. They stacked things near the freezer, heavy items, large carts, boxes, things that weren't meant to be permanent, just temporarily placed while the work continued. What they didn't know was that someone was inside the freezer. At some point during that process, the equipment was placed directly in front of the freezer door, not intentionally to block it, just because it was a convenient place to put things. But the result was the same. The freezer door was effectively sealed shut from the outside, and then the power was turned back on. The cafeteria was being prepared to reopen, which meant electricity, lights, appliances, and the freezer. The freezer came back to life while he was inside it. That's the part of the story that makes my stomach turn every time I think about it. The idea of being trapped in total darkness, realizing the door won't open, and then feeling the temperature start to drop. The sound of the freezer kicking on, the hum of the machinery, knowing what that means. No one knows how long he was alive after that. No one knows if he screamed or banged on the door or tried to claw his way out. The cafeteria was closed. The building was quiet at night. And even if someone had heard something, they probably would have assumed it was just machinery. He froze to death inside that freezer. What makes it worse is that he wasn't found right away. The cafeteria wasn't fully operational yet. The freezer wasn't being used immediately. Days passed, then weeks. From what I was told, his body remained in that freezer for about a month before someone finally discovered him. I don't know who found him. I don't know what that moment was like. I can't imagine opening a freezer and finding a human being frozen inside, stuck to the metal floor. But I do know what happened afterward, because that's the part of the story I can personally confirm. Years later, I stopped working at the bakery and became one of the maintenance workers in that same dormitory hall. I didn't choose the job because of the story. At the time, I didn't even connect the two. It was just another campus job, steady work, familiar buildings. One day, someone mentioned the freezer. Not in a dramatic way, just casually, like it was common knowledge among the maintenance staff. They talked about it the way people talk about something unpleasant but long past. Something that happened, that couldn't be undone, and that everyone wished hadn't. They showed me the freezer. Inside, on the floor, there was a large stain, a messed up section of the metal. The surface wasn't smooth like the rest. It looked damaged, scarred. I was told that when they finally found him, his body had frozen to the floor so completely that they had to pry him off the metal. That mark never came out. No amount of cleaning or repair completely erased it. It's still there, a permanent reminder of what happened. Standing there, looking at that spot, the story stopped being something I'd heard secondhand. It stopped being a rumor or a dark campus legend. It became real, tangible, undeniable. I remember thinking about how many students walk through that building every day, completely unaware of what happened there. They get food, complain about lines, spill drinks, laugh with friends. Life goes on like normal, and just a few feet away, there's a freezer with a scar in the floor where someone died, alone. What haunts me the most is how easily it all could have been avoided. If someone had checked the freezer, if someone had noticed signs of squatting earlier, if the equipment hadn't been placed where it was, if the power hadn't been turned on that night. So many small moments where a different choice could have changed everything. And yet, no one meant for this to happen. That's the hardest part to accept. There was no villain in the traditional sense. No one set out to harm him. He fell through the cracks of a system that wasn't designed to notice someone like him once he was no longer officially part of it. When people talk about campus safety, they usually mean active threats, crimes, things that happen suddenly. They don't talk about slow, quiet tragedies like this, about people who disappear without anyone noticing until it's too late. Every time I walk past that cafeteria now, I think about him, about how he must have felt living there, hiding, surviving, day to day, about how cold that freezer must have been, about how silent the building probably was when it happened. And every time I see that stain in the freezer, I'm reminded that some stories aren't meant to scare you in the moment. They scare you afterward when you realize how close they are to real life, and how easily something like that could happen again without anyone noticing until it's already over. This is a memory my father told me many years ago, and even now, when I think about it, it still feels strange and unsettling in a quiet way. It isn't loud or dramatic, and there are no clear answers at the end of it. It's just one of those stories that stays with you because of how calm it is on the surface and how wrong it feels underneath. When my father was younger, he had a habit of staying awake late into the night. He's always been that way. Someone whose mind doesn't easily shut off when the rest of the world goes quiet. While everyone else in the house would be asleep, he would lie awake, listening to the sounds of the night. This was long before smartphones or constant background noise. Nights were genuinely silent back then, especially in residential areas. When something broke that silence, you noticed it. Every Friday night, without fail, he would hear a sound that slowly became familiar to him. It was the sound of a drum, not fast or energetic, but slow and heavy. The rhythm was always the same. Dum, 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 dum. There was something tired about it, almost lethargic, like the sound itself was dragging its feet. It wasn't music in the way people usually think of music. It didn't feel celebratory or joyful. It felt deliberate, like it had a purpose. At first, my father didn't think much of it. He assumed it was something ordinary, maybe someone practicing an instrument, maybe some kind of local event. But as the weeks went by, he realized something didn't add up. He only ever heard the drums on Friday nights, never on any other day. And the sound didn't stay in one place. Some nights it sounded far away, barely noticeable. Other nights it felt close enough that it made his chest feel tight. The rhythm never changed. It was always slow, always steady, always the same dull beat repeating over and over. Dum, 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 dum. There were no voices, no singing, no other instruments, just the drums moving through the night. One Friday, the sound was closer than it had ever been before. My father said it felt like it was right outside the house. The drums were so loud that he couldn't ignore them anymore. Curiosity started to push past his fear. He got out of bed quietly, careful not to wake anyone else, and walked over to the window. When he looked outside, what he saw confused him more than it frightened him at first. Standing in the street were two men, each carrying a large drum. These weren't small hand drums. They were huge, the kind that hung low and wide, requiring real effort to carry and play at the same time. The men were walking slowly, beating the drums in that same heavy rhythm my father had been hearing for weeks. Between them, resting on a wooden plank or base, sat a young woman. The plank was supported on the men's shoulders, almost like a stretcher, but she wasn't lying down. She was sitting upright. She had black hair, long and dark, and she wasn't moving at all. She wasn't tied up, and she didn't appear distressed. She just sat there, completely still, as if she were part of the structure itself. My father watched them in silence. The men didn't look at the houses. They didn't look around. Their eyes were forward, focused only on the path ahead of them. The woman didn't look around either. She didn't look scared, bored, angry, or sad. She didn't show any emotion at all. She simply existed there, being carried through the street as the drums echoed around her. The whole thing felt unreal. It didn't look like a parade. There were no lights, no crowd, no celebration. It didn't look like a funeral either. There were no candles, no chanting, no visible signs of mourning. It was just three people moving slowly through a sleeping neighborhood, accompanied by the dull, repetitive beat of the drums. After a few moments, they passed out of view. The sound of the drums slowly faded as they moved farther down the street until eventually the night was silent again. My father didn't sleep much after that. He lay awake, replaying what he had seen over and over in his mind. He tried to think of reasonable explanations. Maybe it was some kind of cultural or religious ritual. Maybe it was a tradition he wasn't aware of. But no explanation fully satisfied him. If it was something normal, why did it happen so late at night? Why only on Fridays? And why did it feel so secretive, like something not meant to be observed? The following Friday, the drums returned. This time, my father didn't look out the window. Fear had settled in by then. He stayed in bed, listening as the sound came closer, lingered somewhere nearby, and then slowly moved away again. The same thing happened the next week, and the week after that. Eventually, unable to keep it to himself any longer, my father decided to wake his mother one Friday night when the drums were close. He wanted someone else to see it, to confirm that he wasn't imagining things. He gently woke my grandmother and led her to the window. They watched together as the two men and the woman passed through the street, just as my father had described. When it was over, my grandmother didn't ask many questions. She didn't speculate or try to explain it. She simply told my father not to look at them again. There was something final in the way she said it. Not angry, not panicked, just firm, as if acknowledging it further would somehow make things worse. After that night, my father did as he was told. He stopped looking. He still heard the drums, though. For months afterward, the sound would return every Friday. Sometimes it sounded close, sometimes distant. Sometimes it felt like it was moving through nearby streets, sometimes farther away. But my father never went to the window again. He stayed in bed, frozen, listening until the sound faded into the distance. Eventually, the drums stopped. One Friday came and went without them, and then another. Life moved on. My father grew older, left that house, started a family of his own. But the memory never left him. To this day, he doesn't know who those people were or why they did what they did. He suspects it was connected to some kind of religion or cult, something practiced quietly and deliberately, away from public attention. But he has no proof. No one else ever talked about it openly. There were no news stories, no explanations, no follow-up. What makes the story unsettling isn't just what happened, but how ordinary it all seemed. There was no chaos, no violence, no dramatic confrontation, just a slow procession moving through the night, repeating itself week after week as if it were part of a schedule only they understood. When my father tells this story, he doesn't exaggerate it. He doesn't try to make it scarier than it is. He tells it plainly, almost casually. But there's always a pause when he talks about the woman sitting on the plank. doing nothing, saying nothing, looking nowhere in particular. That image seems to bother him the most. He's never claimed it was something supernatural. He's never said it was ghosts or demons or anything like that. But he's also never been able to fully explain it, and maybe that's why it stayed with him. Some things don't need a dramatic ending to be frightening. Sometimes not knowing is worse. For me, hearing this story as a child planted a quiet fear in my mind. It made me think differently about the night, about the things that might happen while most people are asleep. It made me realize that there are traditions, beliefs, and practices that exist entirely outside our awareness, moving through the world without ever asking to be understood. Even now, when I think about late nights and empty streets, I sometimes imagine that slow, heavy rhythm echoing in the distance. Dum, 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 dum. And I wonder how many things pass by unnoticed, simply because we aren't looking out the window when they do. This is a story my mother told me when I was older, something that happened when I was still a baby, back in the late 1980s. I don't remember any of it myself, obviously, but the way she described it and the way her voice would change when she talked about it made it feel very real and very close. It's one of those stories that makes you realize how fragile safety can be, and how sometimes survival comes down to chance and the actions of complete strangers. When I was an infant, my mother used to take me out for walks almost every day. It was part of her routine. I was still small enough to be in a stroller, and walking with me gave her a reason to get out of the house, get some fresh air, and give me a chance to nap. We lived in a fairly quiet area, not completely rural, but not busy either. The streets were calm, lined with houses, trees, and sidewalks. It felt like the kind of place where you didn't have to constantly look over your shoulder. For the first couple of weeks, everything seemed normal. My mother would bundle me up, put me in the stroller, and walk the same general routes. She liked consistency, and babies do too, but after a while she started noticing something that didn't sit right with her. She began to see the same green car. At first, she didn't think much of it. Seeing the same car more than once in your neighborhood isn't unusual. People live nearby, people visit friends, people take similar routes. The first few times, she brushed it off completely, but then it kept happening. Day after day, that green car would appear somewhere along her walk. Sometimes it would be parked on the street as she passed by. Other times it would slowly drive past her. Occasionally she noticed it behind her, moving at the same pace she was walking, then stopping when she stopped. It wasn't always obvious enough to immediately trigger panic, but it was consistent enough that it started to feel wrong. My mother was young at the time, and like a lot of people, she didn't want to assume the worst. She told herself she was being paranoid. She told herself it was probably just someone who lived in the area or worked nearby. But the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it grew stronger with each walk. She started paying closer attention. She noticed that the car wasn't just present randomly. It seemed to appear wherever she went. If she changed her route slightly, the car would still show up. If she turned down a different street, there it was again. Sometimes it would be ahead of her, parked. Sometimes behind her. Always green. Always the same car. That's when fear started to creep in. She began to feel watched. Not just noticed, but observed. Like someone was deliberately keeping track of her movements. And the most terrifying part was that she was alone, pushing a stroller with a baby who couldn't protect himself and depended entirely on her. Still, she kept walking. Part of her didn't want to give up something that had become part of her daily life. Another part of her didn't want to admit that something might actually be wrong. She didn't want to believe that someone could be targeting her and her baby in broad daylight, in a neighborhood that seemed so normal. Then one day, everything escalated. On that day, the green car didn't just follow at a distance. At some point during her walk, the car pulled over and parked. My mother noticed it immediately. Her heart started racing, but she kept walking, hoping it was nothing, hoping the driver would stay in the car or drive away. Instead, the man got out. He waited until my mother had passed the car. Then he started walking behind her. Not right up close, but close enough to be unmistakable. About 20 feet behind her, matching her pace. Not passing her, not turning away, just following. At that moment, there was no more doubt. This wasn't coincidence, this wasn't paranoia, this was real. My mother could feel the fear in her chest. She could hear her own heartbeat. She didn't want to turn around fully, but she could sense him there. Every instinct in her body was screaming that something was very wrong. She was pushing a stroller, trying not to panic, trying to think clearly while knowing that she couldn't run easily and couldn't fight if it came to that. She thought about screaming. She thought about knocking on a door. She thought about turning around and confronting him. But fear can freeze you just as much as it can push you to act. She didn't know what the safest move was. That's when two older women noticed what was happening. They were walking together on the same street a short distance ahead. They saw my mother, saw the stroller, and saw the man following behind her. Something about the situation immediately set off alarm bells for them. Maybe it was the way he kept his distance. Maybe it was the way my mother looked, tense and frightened. Maybe it was just intuition. Whatever it was, they knew something wasn't right. One of them turned around and made eye contact with my mother. My mom later said that look alone made her feel like she might be okay. The women slowed down and waited until my mother caught up to them. Then, without hesitation, they spoke to her like they already knew her. They asked if she was okay. They asked if the man behind her was with her. My mother shook her head. That was all it took. The two women immediately took control of the situation. They positioned themselves between my mother and the man, blocking his path without directly confronting him. One of them guided my mother and the stroller toward a nearby house. Whether it was one of their homes or just a house they knew was occupied, I don't know. What mattered was that they got her inside quickly. Once the door was closed and locked, my mother finally broke down. The fear she had been holding back spilled out all at once. She told them about the green car, about how she had seen it for weeks, about how the man had been following her, about how scared she was. The women didn't dismiss her. They didn't tell her she was imagining things. They didn't minimize what had happened. They believed her immediately. They called the police. When the police arrived, things became even more serious. The man was still in the area. The green car was still nearby. The officers spoke to my mother, then went to find him. What they discovered confirmed that her fear had been completely justified. The man was already being investigated for similar behavior. He wasn't just some random passerby. He had a history. He had been suspected of following women, possibly targeting mothers with young children. The details of those investigations were never fully shared with my mother, and she didn't ask for them. She didn't want to know. Knowing that he was already on the police's radar was enough. The police handled the situation from there. My mother was shaken but safe. She was able to go home with me, physically unharmed, but deeply affected by what had happened. For a long time after that, she stopped going on walks alone. When she did go out, she was hyper-aware of her surroundings. She checked reflections in windows. She memorized license plates. She trusted her instincts in a way she hadn't before. Years later, when she finally told me this story, she emphasized one thing more than anything else. Those two women saved us. If they hadn't been there, if they hadn't noticed, if they had decided it wasn't their business, the outcome could have been very different. My mother doesn't like to speculate too much about what might have happened, but the fear in her voice, makes it clear that she believes things could have gone terribly wrong. I think about that often. I think about how close danger can be without us realizing it, how someone can blend into the background for weeks, watching, waiting, testing boundaries. I think about how vulnerable my mother must have felt pushing a stroller, trying to protect a baby while being followed by a stranger. Most of all, I think about those two older women. They didn't have to get involved. They could have looked away. They could have assumed everything was fine. Instead, they paid attention. They trusted their instincts. They acted. Because of them, I grew up. Because of them, my mother got to go home that day. Because of them, a man who was actively stalking women was stopped, at least in that moment. It's strange to think that my life, in a very real way, might hinge on the awareness and courage of two strangers whose names I'll probably never know. They didn't become heroes in any official sense. There were no headlines, no awards, just a quiet intervention that changed everything. When people talk about being aware of your surroundings or looking out for others, this is what I think of. Not dramatic rescues or confrontations, but small, decisive actions taken at the right moment. I also think about how easily my mother's concerns could have been dismissed. How often people, especially women, are told they're overreacting or imagining things. If she had ignored her instincts completely, if she had convinced herself it was nothing, the situation might have escalated even further. Fear, in this case, was a warning, and attention was the difference between danger and safety. Even now, decades later, I feel a deep sense of gratitude toward those two women. They didn't know us. They didn't owe us anything. But they saw a mother and a baby in danger, and they stepped in without hesitation. Thank God for those two women. Without them, this story might have ended very differently. In the early 2000s, when I was a teenager, me and 3 of my friends used to drive out to a place everyone around town called the strip mines. It was one of those places that felt forgotten by time, the kind of area adults warned you about but never really explained. For us, it was just somewhere to go when there was nothing else to do. We lived in a small town, the kind where everyone knows everyone, and boredom was a constant companion. There wasn't much to do after dark except drive around, listen to music, and smoke a little pot. The strip mines were perfect for that because nobody ever seemed to be out there. The whole area was made up of endless gravel roads that twisted and looped around each other for miles. You could drive for a long time without seeing another car or a single house. Every now and then there would be an entrance or an exit that connected to a named road. But most of the time it was just dirt, gravel, empty hillsides, and patches of woods that completely surrounded you. It felt isolated in a way that was both relaxing and unsettling at the same time. During the day, it already had a strange vibe, but at night, it felt like you were cut off from the rest of the world. In the middle of all this was a large lake. It was actually a pretty popular fishing spot for older guys, the kind who would sit quietly for hours with a cooler and a folding chair. Sometimes we'd see them driving in or out, usually early in the morning or late in the afternoon. Most of the time, though, the gravel parking lot by the lake was empty. If we got bored of driving, we'd park and walk around the water, throwing rocks or just talking about nothing. It felt harmless, at least that's how it felt back then. We had driven those roads so many times that we had a rough map of the place in our heads. We knew which loops connected to others, how long it took to get in and out, and which directions would eventually lead you back to a named road. The general rule was that if you just kept driving long enough, you'd come out somewhere familiar, and if you could do that, you'd make it home. That knowledge made us feel confident, maybe more confident than we should have been. There were always rumors about the strip mines when we were in high school. People talked about cults and satanic churches hidden out there in the woods. It was the kind of thing teenagers loved to exaggerate, and we never really took it seriously. The only strange things we had ever found were a broken-down cemetery and some old foundations where buildings had once stood. You could find dilapidated headstones scattered around if you stopped and walked down some of the hills. They were old, cracked, and sometimes half-buried, like the land itself was trying to swallow them back up. It was creepy, sure, but nothing that felt dangerous at the time. What we didn't know back then was that the government had used parts of that land for forestry tests and for relocating animals, especially to control or eradicate certain pest species. I didn't learn that until years later. Back then, none of that crossed our minds. We were just kids looking for a place to be alone, and in all the time we spent out there, I only ever experienced one thing that truly scared me. That one experience is what I'm telling now. One day, while driving around like usual, we came across a road that was blocked by a gate. Around the gate, there was a lot of old farm equipment, all broken down and rusting. The grass had grown high around it, almost suffocating the machines, like nature was slowly reclaiming everything. The gate itself didn't look especially secure. It wasn't some heavy-duty barrier, just enough to stop cars from driving through. Beyond the gate, you could see that the road continued for about 40 yards before turning into blacktop. That alone made it stand out, because almost everything out there was dirt or gravel. At the time, the gate was closed, so we also didn't think much of it. It just became another strange detail in a place full of strange details. But on another day, when we went back out there, we noticed something different. The gate was open. It was wide open, like someone had just left it that way. We all noticed it at the same time, and after a few seconds of talking it over, we decided to drive through. The plan was simple. We'd go in, see what was there, turn around, and leave as fast as possible if anyone showed up. We were about 17 at the time. I know I was for sure, and the others might have been a little older. Looking back now, it's crazy how little fear we had. It never crossed our minds that we could get shot for trespassing on private property. We didn't think about landowners or guards or anything like that. We just thought it was another road. So we drove through the gate and made it onto the blacktop. Almost immediately, maybe 100 to 150 feet in, there was a turn to the right that went up a very steep hill. You couldn't even see this road from the gate. The entire opening was hidden by trees and thick vines that formed a canopy over it. The blacktop went straight up until it looked like it flattened out at the top. We decided to take the turn and drive up, just to see what was there. The hill was so steep that my friend, who was driving, had to put the car into first gear just to make it up. As soon as we reached the top and went over the horizon, everything changed. We came face to face with what looked like a dozen or more men, all dressed in black. They were some distance ahead of us, but close enough that there was no doubt about what we were seeing. It was the middle of the day, bright out, no shadows or tricks of the light. We all saw them at the same time. For a few seconds, nobody said anything. We just sat there, staring, trying to process what was in front of us. Some of the men were wearing nice dress slacks with their shirts tucked in and black cowboy hats. The outfits didn't match exactly, but every single one of them was dressed in solid black. As far back as I could see, there was one figure that stood out the most. It looked like someone wearing a robe, and they were very short, maybe around 4 feet tall. To this day, I still argue with one of my friends about this. He insists it was just a stump with a robe thrown over it, but I swear it wasn't. That figure had what looked like a huge cane or crook, something that stood much taller than they did. It really looked to me like there was a hand holding it. There were 3 vehicles parked there, and they were all black too. 2 of them looked like Suburbans or at least large SUVs. The third was a black sedan. I can't say for sure what the exact models were, but they were definitely SUVs and a sedan, all dark, all clean, and all out of place. For about 10 seconds, we just stared at each other. It felt like time slowed down. Then a heavyset man wearing a cowboy hat yelled something. I couldn't make out what he said, but his voice was loud and angry. Almost immediately, two of the men started running toward our car. That was when panic hit. Everyone inside the car started screaming at the driver to turn around and go. He reacted fast. Thankfully, he was the best driver out of all of us. He tried as hard as he could to turn the car around on that narrow stretch of road. As soon as the car was facing the right direction, one of the men was close enough that I could clearly hear him yelling for us to get out of the car. At the same time, we didn't notice that another man had gotten into the black sedan behind them. I was sitting in the back seat, and I turned around to look out the rear window. I saw one of the men standing at the top of the hill, watching us as we sped away. We were almost all the way down the hill when I saw the sedan come over the horizon. That was when I realized they were chasing us. We drove as fast as we could, down the blacktop road. It was narrow with no room for error, but we were already going around 50 miles per hour. The sedan came screeching around the hidden turn behind us, staying right on our tail. Inside the car, everything was chaos. Two of my friends were crying hysterically. Everyone was yelling at the driver to go faster to get us out of there. I was on my knees in the back seat, watching through the rear window, seeing how close they were. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I had never been that scared in my life. We finally reached the gate entrance. The driver took a hard right turn, throwing gravel and rocks everywhere as we slid back onto the dirt road. The car barely stayed under control. The whole time, I was still watching behind us, expecting the sedan to follow. As we were about to make another turn, I saw something that shocked me even more. The sedan stopped at the gate. Its backup lights came on. They didn't follow us any further. They just let us leave. They had chased us all the way out of that road and then stopped, like their territory ended right there. After that day, we asked a few adults around town if they knew what went on out there. We told our story, expecting someone to laugh or brush it off. One friend who wasn't with us that day had a dad who was a deputy game warden. When we told him what happened, his response was very serious. He told us we shouldn't go back out there and that we should mind our own business. There was no joking in his voice. At the time, we thought he might just be trying to scare us because, as far as we knew, nobody had ever been hurt out there. Years passed, and now I'm in my 30s. Over time, I've heard all kinds of stories about that place. The strip mines connect to a state park that has its own share of strange stories. There was even a case of a missing person who was eventually found. She claimed she had been kidnapped and drugged by a cult. The area she described was very close to where we had seen those men in black. Most people in town call her crazy. They say she wasn't like that before she went missing, or at least that's what the rumors say. I don't know what those men were doing out there that day. Maybe it wasn't a cult. Maybe there's some other explanation. But I know what I saw. I know how they reacted to us being there, and I know how it felt to be chased off that hill by men who clearly did not want to be seen. Whatever they were not friendly, and they made sure we understood that. About an hour and a half away from the town where I grew up, there is a mountain range that was always a big part of my childhood. At the very top of it sits a small cafe and a gift shop. Nothing fancy, just a warm, welcoming place where people could stop, eat, and enjoy the view. You can drive all the way up there on winding roads that curve back and forth along the mountainside. Despite how they look, the roads are actually quite safe and well maintained, and for locals they were just another familiar drive. For my family, going up that mountain became a tradition. Almost every Christmas Eve, we would pile into the car and make the drive together to have lunch at the cafe. It was our way of slowing down before the chaos of Christmas Day, a quiet moment where it was just us, the road and the mountains. I always looked forward to it. The drive itself felt special, like part of the celebration. The trees, the cool air, the way the world seemed to drop away as you climbed higher and higher. It felt peaceful, almost magical, especially as a child. Because we went there every year, the route became very familiar. I knew the bends in the road, the spots where you could glimpse the valley below, and the long stretches where the trees closed in and made everything feel secluded. There was one particular part of the road that we always passed without much thought. It was a lay-by, a small pull-off area where cars could stop. It wasn't large or remarkable, just a quiet spot carved into the side of the road. We drove past it every single time, both on the way up and on the way back down. For years, it meant nothing to me. It was just another part of the drive, another place that flashed past the window. But one year, I heard something about that lay-by that changed how I saw it forever. I don't remember exactly how I first learned about it. It may have been something someone mentioned casually or something I overheard adults talking about. What I do remember is the image that formed in my mind as soon as I heard the story. Even now, years later, that image is still crystal clear. I learned that not long before, a man had parked his car in that lay-by with his 2 young children. He had connected a hose from the car's exhaust into the inside of the vehicle. All 3 of them had suffocated to death there, alone on that quiet mountain road. The idea of it hit me hard. It was such a dark, disturbing thing to imagine, especially in a place I associated with family, tradition, and warmth. At the time, I was young, and my mind struggled to make sense of it. I remember thinking that it couldn't possibly be true. It sounded too horrible, too unreal. For a while, I convinced myself that it must be an urban legend, one of those stories people tell that grow darker and more dramatic with each retelling. Kids hear things, misunderstand them, and suddenly a rumor turns into something much bigger than reality. That's what I told myself. Still, every time we drove past that lay-by after that, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I would look out the window as we passed, my stomach tightening. It no longer felt like just another patch of road. It felt heavy, like it carried something unseen. I imagined the car sitting there, the silence, the isolation. The contrast between the beauty of the mountain and the horror of what had happened there made it even worse. A few years later, when I was a bit older, the story came back into my mind. By then, I was old enough to want real answers instead of comforting excuses. During one of our Christmas Eve visits, I decided to ask the owner of the cafe about it. Over the years, my family had come to know him a little. We weren't close friends, but we exchanged pleasantries every year, and there was a sense of familiarity there. When I asked him about the lay-by, I half expected him to laugh it off or tell me it was just a rumor. Instead, his response was calm and serious. He told me that the story was 100% true. It had been reported in the newspapers and shown on television. It wasn't a legend or a rumor. It had really happened. Hearing that confirmation sent a chill through me. There was something about knowing it was real that made it so much worse. It wasn't just a scary idea anymore. It was something that had actually occurred in the real world, in a place I knew well, a place my family visited regularly, a place that until then had only ever felt safe and familiar. After that, the mountain never felt quite the same to me. I still loved the drive, the cafe, and the tradition, but there was always that shadow in the back of my mind. Every time we passed the lay-by, I thought about that man and his children. I wondered what had led him to make that decision. I wondered what those final moments must have been like. The questions had no answers, and that made them even more haunting. As a young lad, the story scared me deeply. It wasn't the kind of fear that makes you jump or scream. It was quieter than that, more persistent. It sat with me, especially at night. I would think about how close we all are to places where terrible things have happened, often without ever knowing it. How ordinary locations can hide unimaginable tragedies. What frightened me most was how normal everything around it seemed. The road was safe, the drive was pleasant. Families like mine went up and down that mountain all the time, laughing, talking, planning meals. And yet, in that same space, something so dark had taken place. It made the world feel less predictable, less secure. Even now, years later, I don't think of that story as exciting or dramatic. There were no chases, no supernatural elements, no mystery to solve. It was simply a tragedy. But sometimes those are the stories that stay with you the longest. They don't rely on shock or spectacle. They linger because they remind you of how fragile life can be and how close darkness can exist to normal, everyday routines. That lay-by is still there as far as I know. Cars still pass it every day. People probably stop there without ever realizing what happened. For most of them, it's just another place on the road. But for me, it will always be tied to that story. It's a reminder of something I learned far too young, that the world isn't always as safe or simple as it seems. It's a story I will never forget, not because it was thrilling, but because it quietly changed the way I looked at familiar places. It taught me that even the most ordinary settings can carry hidden histories, and once you know them, you can never quite see those places the same way again. Sorry to interrupt. If you're new here, I'd appreciate it if you subscribe to Shadow Archives for daily true horror content that will haunt your dreams and keep you wondering what lurks in the shadows. And don't forget to tap the notification bell so you never miss a new story when the darkness calls out to you. This is something my father told me only after I was grown, long after the fear had already done its job. When I was a kid, I thought it was just another scary story adults tell children to keep them in line. Looking back now, knowing the truth behind it, the story feels a lot heavier. It isn't a legend. It isn't folklore. It's something real that happened in my hometown. And the reason my father chose fear over honesty still makes sense to me. I grew up in a small town, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, or at least thinks they do. It was quiet, surrounded by fields, trees, and patches of water scattered around the outskirts. There were ponds everywhere. Some were natural, some were old quarry pits that filled with rainwater over the years, and some were just forgotten stretches of land that collected water and never dried up. As kids, we were naturally drawn to them. Water always feels like an invitation when you're young. You want to throw rocks, catch frogs, see how deep it is, maybe dare each other to wade in. But my siblings and I were never allowed anywhere near ponds. Other kids could play by them. They could fish, explore, or just sit by the edge. We couldn't. My dad was strict about it in a way that went beyond normal parental caution. He didn't just say no. He made sure we were afraid. He told us a story. He said there was a little girl who lived in the ponds around our town. She wasn't like a ghost in the way you see in movies. She didn't scream or rattle chains. She looked like a normal little girl, lonely, sad. He said she would sit just under the surface of the water, watching. If a child came too close, she would reach out, grab them, and pull them under. Not to hurt them, he said, but to play with them forever. To keep them with her so she wouldn't be alone anymore. That part scared us the most. The idea that she wasn't angry or evil, just lonely. He told us she especially liked children who wandered off by themselves. Kids who leaned too far over the edge. Kids who thought the water looked calm and harmless. He said once she grabbed you, no one would ever find you again. You'd just disappear. We believed him. When you're a kid, you don't question stories like that. You don't think about logic or probability. You just know that ponds are dangerous and there's something in them that wants you. So we stayed away. We didn't go near the water. We didn't throw rocks. We didn't test how close was too close. Even when other kids tried to tease us or dared us to go near one, we refused. Fear is an effective teacher. Years passed. We grew up. The story faded into the background, filed away with other childhood fears. The dark, the woods at night, strange noises. I didn't think about the pond girl much anymore. She became just another thing my dad made up to keep us safe, like warnings about quicksand or strangers with candy. Then, when I was an adult, my dad finally told me the truth. We were sitting together just talking when the subject of childhood rules came up. I joked about how strict he had been about ponds. I laughed and mentioned the story about the girl in the water. I expected him to laugh too. He didn't. Instead, he got quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you realize you've stumbled into something serious. After a moment, he told me that the story wasn't just something he invented out of nowhere. It was built on something real. There really was a dead girl in a pond in our hometown. He told me that years before I was born, a young girl had been killed. Not an accident, not a drowning. She had been murdered. Her body was hidden in one of the ponds around town. The case was never officially solved in a way that brought closure. No public answers, no marked grave that people could visit. What made it worse was how my dad knew. One of the people involved in hiding her body told him, not in a dramatic confession, not in a moment of guilt that led to justice. Just a quiet, careless admission. A man my dad knew, someone connected enough to the crime to be dangerous, told him that there was a girl in a pond. He never said which pond. He never gave details. He didn't need to. The message was clear enough. My dad understood immediately what that meant. He knew better than to ask questions. In a small town, asking the wrong questions can get you hurt. It can get your family hurt. The man who told him wasn't someone you challenged. He wasn't someone you reported and then went back to living a normal life. People like that don't just disappear when you call the police. They notice. They remember. So my dad kept his mouth shut. He didn't tell the authorities. He didn't tell neighbors. He didn't tell friends. He carried that knowledge alone. And then he had kids. That's when the fear set in. He knew there was a body in one of those ponds. He knew there were people walking around town who had helped put her there. Child killers. People capable of things most of us can't even imagine. He couldn't protect us from all of that directly. He couldn't explain it to us without putting us at risk. But he could keep us away from the places where danger might still linger. So he chose the only tool he had, a story. He turned a real, horrifying truth into a ghost story that children could understand. He made the pond itself the threat instead of the people responsible. He made the danger feel supernatural because that was safer than telling us there were real men nearby who had killed a child and gotten away with it. And it worked. We stayed away from the ponds. We stayed alive. We stayed ignorant, which in this case was protection. When he finished telling me all of this, I didn't know what to say. Part of me felt sick. Another part felt strangely grateful. He had carried that burden alone for years just to keep us safe. He had lived with the knowledge that somewhere beneath still water there was a child who never got justice. I asked him if he ever thought about reporting it later once we were grown. He shook his head. He said some doors don't close once you open them. Some truths don't make you safer just because they're out in the open. He said he did what he thought was right with the information he had in the world he lived in. I understand that now. What haunts me most isn't just the idea of a body hidden in a pond. It's the idea of how close we were to it. How many times we must have driven past it. How many summer days we played nearby without knowing what was beneath the surface. How ordinary everything looked. Water hides things well. Even now, when I go back to my hometown and pass by those ponds, I feel a chill. They look peaceful, calm, reflecting the sky like nothing bad has ever happened there. People fish, Kids play nearby, life goes on, but I know better. I know that one of them holds a secret that was heavy enough to shape my childhood. I know that somewhere in that town, there are people who know exactly where she is and chose silence. I know my father chose fear over truth because fear kept us alive. The story of the pond girl doesn't scare me anymore in the way it did when I was a child. What scares me now is how easily real horrors can be hidden behind quiet places and still water. How sometimes the scariest stories parents tell their kids aren't meant to entertain or exaggerate, but to protect them from truths that are too dangerous to say out loud. And every time I think about that little girl, the real one, not the ghost from the story, I wonder how many people walk past her every day without knowing she's there. How many secrets small towns bury, not just in the ground, but in silence. My father never told us the truth until it was safe to do so, and even then, he told it carefully. That alone tells me everything I need to know about how real the danger once was. Some stories are meant to scare children. Some stories are meant to keep them alive. This one did both. A couple of years ago, I was working at a hotel, and for a stretch of time I was often the only employee on duty during the night shift. It wasn't a big place, just a quiet hotel that mostly catered to travelers passing through. Night shifts were usually uneventful. Most guests checked in earlier in the evening, and after that, the building settled into a kind of uneasy calm. The lights were dim, the halls were quiet, and the hours stretched on slowly until morning. On this particular night, there were only a handful of guests staying at the hotel. Among them were two men who had checked in together. I didn't think much of them at first. They didn't stand out, and nothing about their behavior earlier in the evening raised any red flags. They were just two guys staying for the night, like dozens of others I'd seen before. Late into my shift, both of them came down to the lobby. They were clearly drunk, not just buzzed, but heavily intoxicated. You could smell the alcohol on them. As soon as they walked in, their movements were sloppy, their speech was loud and uneven, and they had that unpredictable energy that drunk people sometimes have. Still, at first, the interaction seemed harmless enough. They started talking to me casually, making small talk, asking questions about the area, joking around. I answered politely, trying to keep things friendly but professional. When you work alone at night, you learn how to balance being approachable without encouraging people to linger too long. At that point, I wasn't alarmed. I figured they'd talk for a few minutes and then head back to their room. As the conversation went on, though, the drunker of the two started oversharing. At first, it was just nonsense, rambling stories that didn't really go anywhere. Then, out of nowhere, he mentioned that he was staying at the hotel because there was a warrant out for his arrest in his home state. He said it casually, almost like it was a joke. I remember pausing for a moment when he said that, but I didn't immediately panic. Warrants can mean a lot of things. Missing a court date, unpaid fines, probation issues. People exaggerate when they're drunk. I told myself it probably wasn't anything serious, and I tried not to react. The mood shifted immediately after that. The other guy, who was definitely less drunk and much more aware of what was going on, suddenly became tense. His body language changed completely. He leaned in close to his friend and started whispering urgently, telling him to shut up. He kept glancing at me, then back at his friend, clearly alarmed by what was being said. He tried to steer the conversation away from anything personal and started encouraging him to go back to their room. That was the moment I started feeling uncomfortable. The drunker guy didn't stop. In fact, he seemed to get worse. He kept talking, slurring his words, drifting from one topic to another. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't a clear confession, but it was close enough that it stuck with me immediately. Through the slurred speech, the only part I could hear clearly was, "He's too far down for them to find." I didn't ask him to repeat it. I didn't ask any follow-up questions. I just stood there, trying to keep my face neutral while my mind raced. The implication was horrifying. Whether he meant it literally or was just talking nonsense, I didn't know. But the way his friend reacted told me everything I needed to know about how serious it might be. His friend completely panicked. Without another word, he turned and practically ran back toward the rooms, leaving me alone in the lobby with the drunk man. The suddenness of it was unsettling. One second, there were two of them, and the next, it was just me, and someone who had just hinted at killing someone. For the next few hours, he stayed in the lobby. He rambled non-stop. He talked about random things that made no sense, jumping from subject to subject, occasionally repeating himself. Sometimes he laughed, sometimes he stared off into space. I kept my distance, staying behind the desk, watching him carefully. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to be cautious. Eventually, sometime later in the night, he finally wandered back to his room. I didn't relax until I heard the elevator doors close and the lobby was empty again. Even then, I stayed on edge for the rest of my shift, replaying everything he had said and done in my head. The next night, I was back at work again. This time, both men came down to the lobby sober. That alone made me nervous. Drunk behavior can sometimes be written off as stupidity or lack of control. Sober behavior is a choice. I didn't want to interact with them at all, so I stayed in the small room next to the front desk, the one we used for paperwork and breaks. I locked the door behind me. After a few minutes, one of them came up to the door. He said he needed to talk to me. His voice was calm, almost friendly, but there was something off about it. I told him I couldn't unlock the door. I kept my voice steady, professional, firm. He didn't like that. He started banging on the door. Not lightly, but hard enough to make the door shake. He grabbed the handle and began aggressively jiggling it, trying to force it open. The sound echoed through the quiet lobby, each bang making my heart pound harder. As he did this, he kept talking through the door. He kept saying things like, "I won't hurt you," and "I just need to talk to you." The words themselves might have sounded reassuring in another context, but paired with his actions, they were terrifying. People who don't intend to hurt you don't usually need to convince you of that while trying to break down a locked door. I stood there, frozen, my phone in my hand. I told him that if he didn't leave immediately, I was going to call the police. That finally made him stop. After a tense moment, both men left the lobby and went back to their room. I didn't call the police. I wish I could say I did, but I didn't. The last time I had called them for a situation at work, they had brushed me off and told me I was wasting their time. That memory stuck with me, and in that moment, I didn't trust that they would take me seriously. I chose to just get through the rest of the shift and hope nothing else happened. The next day was my day off. I was trying to relax when I got a text from a coworker. As soon as I read it, my stomach dropped. He told me that one of the men had come to the front desk and started asking questions about me. He wanted my last name. He wanted my phone number. He wanted to know my work schedule. My coworker didn't give him my name or my number, thankfully, but he did give him my schedule. When I read that, I felt sick. Knowing that someone like that now knew exactly when I would be working made me feel exposed and unsafe in a way I hadn't felt before. I immediately called my boss and told him everything that had happened, from the first night to the door incident to the questions about my schedule. My boss was on vacation at the time, but when he heard the story, he didn't hesitate. He came back early. As soon as he returned, he confronted the men and kicked them out of the hotel. He told them that if they came back, they would be arrested for harassment. After that, I never saw them again. I don't know for certain whether that man actually killed someone. I don't have proof. I don't know if his drunken rambling was a confession or just the twisted imagination of someone who had been drinking too much. But based on how both of them acted, especially the panic from the other guy and the aggression that followed, I don't think it was just meaningless talk. What scares me the most when I think back on it is how close it all felt, how easily things could have gone differently. I was alone. I was trapped in a building with someone who might have been capable of real violence if that door hadn't been locked, if I hadn't trusted my instincts, if things had escalated just a little more. I don't know what would have happened. Sometimes the scariest experiences aren't the ones with clear answers or dramatic endings. They're the ones where you're left wondering how much of what you heard was true, and how close you came to being part of something much worse. Even now, years later, that night still sits with me, not because of what definitely happened, but because of what very nearly could have. This is a story that has been passed down through my family for generations, and even though it happened more than 100 years ago, it has never lost its ability to unsettle me. It isn't told with embellishment or drama, and there are no heroic moments or lessons neatly wrapped at the end. It's simply a tragedy that began as a cruel joke and ended in a way no one could have imagined. The fact that it involves someone from my own bloodline makes it feel heavier, like something that still echoes forward through time. The events took place sometime in the late 1800s or the very early 1900s, during a period when one of my ancestors owned land with coffee plantations. This was not a small operation. The land was large enough that it required regular patrols, long walks through fields and wooded areas, and constant attention to keep things running smoothly. Life back then was very different from what we know now. There were no modern conveniences, no quick access to doctors, and no easy way to call for help if something went wrong. People lived much closer to the land, and that meant living much closer to danger as well. Snakes were a constant threat in that region. They were common, especially around plantations where rodents were plentiful. Everyone who lived and worked on the land knew this. Encounters with snakes weren't rare, and killing them was often seen as a necessary part of protecting the property and the people on it. Machetes were common tools used for clearing brush, harvesting crops, and defending against animals when needed. On one particular day, my ancestor was making his usual rounds across the land. He was checking the plantations, walking familiar paths, focused on his work. At some point during his patrol, he came across a snake. There's no indication that the snake attacked him or behaved unusually. It was simply there, and he reacted the way many men of that time would have. He killed it with his machete. On its own, that would have been an unremarkable event. Just another danger dealt with, another day on the land. But what happened afterward is what turned this ordinary moment into a nightmare. My ancestor's wife was known to be deeply afraid of snakes. This wasn't a mild discomfort or dislike. It was a genuine, intense fear. She knew they lived in the area, and that knowledge alone caused her anxiety. Seeing one, even a dead one, would have terrified her. My understanding is that she was away from the house for part of that day, possibly visiting someone or attending to other responsibilities. For reasons that are still hard to understand, my ancestor decided to turn the dead snake into a prank. It's difficult to reconcile this decision with the image of a man living in that era, responsible for land, workers, and a household. But people have always been capable of cruelty, even toward those they love, especially when they underestimate the consequences. He knew how afraid his wife was. That fear is exactly why he thought it would be funny. He brought the dead snake back to the house and hid it in their bedroom. The place that should have been the safest, most private space in their home became the setting for his joke. When his wife returned later that day and went into the bedroom, he locked the door behind her, trapping her inside with the snake. At first, her reaction was exactly what he expected. She screamed. She yelled that there was a snake. She cried out for help. Her fear was immediate and overwhelming. From the other side of the door, he could hear her panic. He could hear her calling for him, begging him to let her out, and he ignored her. Whether he thought she would calm down or whether he was enjoying the fear he had caused, no one knows. What we do know is that he did nothing. He let her scream. He let her cry. He let her believe she was in danger, all for the sake of a cruel joke. Then, suddenly, the screaming stopped. At first, he may have thought she had fainted or gone quiet out of exhaustion. Maybe he assumed the prank had gone far enough. Whatever went through his mind in those moments, it didn't include the possibility of what had actually happened. When he finally unlocked the door and went into the bedroom, he was met with a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. His wife was lying on the floor, dead, and she was not alone. Inside the room was a second snake. This snake was alive. The most likely explanation, as it has been told in my family, is that the second snake had followed the scent of the first. Snakes rely heavily on scent, and the presence of a dead snake in the house would have been an unnatural but powerful signal. Drawn by that scent, the second snake entered the bedroom while my ancestor's wife was trapped inside. In her panic, already terrified by what she believed was a threat, she likely didn't notice the second snake until it was too late, or perhaps she did notice, and that realization is what caused her screams to suddenly stop. The snake bit her. In that time and place, a venomous snake bite was often a death sentence. There were no anti-venoms readily available, no hospitals nearby, no rapid medical response. Even if help had been summoned immediately, there may have been nothing anyone could do, but help never had a chance to arrive because she was locked in the room. She died alone, terrified, trapped by the person she trusted most. The weight of that realization is hard to put into words. My ancestor didn't just lose his wife that day. He became responsible for her death in a way that could never be undone. What started as a joke, something meant to scare and then be laughed off, turned into a tragedy that destroyed two lives, hers because she died, and his because he had to live with what he had done. There are no detailed records of what happened to him afterward. Family stories say he was never the same. How could he be? Every time he closed his eyes, he would have remembered her screams. Every quiet moment would have been filled with the knowledge that if he had opened the door sooner, if he had never brought the snake home, if he had simply respected her fear, she would still be alive. This story has always been told in my family as a warning, though not in a moralizing way. No one ever says, "This is what happens when you play pranks." Instead, it's told plainly, almost coldly, as if the facts alone are enough. And they are. What makes it especially disturbing is how ordinary it all began. There was no malice in the beginning, no intention to kill, just arrogance, just cruelty disguised as humor, just a man believing he was in control of a situation he didn't fully understand. The presence of the second snake feels almost symbolic, as if nature itself responded to his actions. He brought danger into his home, thinking it was contained, thinking it was harmless because it was dead. He didn't consider what else might follow. Whenever I think about this story, I think about how fragile safety really is, how quickly a home can become a place of terror, how trust, once broken in such a final way, leaves nothing behind but regret. I also think about his wife, about her fear, which was known and dismissed, about how she must have felt in those moments, screaming for help and not being answered, about the betrayal she experienced before she ever felt the snake's bite. This isn't a ghost story or a legend meant to entertain. It's a family memory that has survived because it carries something uncomfortable and true. People don't always mean to cause harm, but that doesn't lessen the damage when harm is done. Fear is not something to play with, and some mistakes don't give you a second chance to make things right. Even now, more than a century later, this story still feels alive. It's a reminder that cruelty, even when disguised as humor, can open the door to consequences far beyond what anyone expects. And once that door is opened, there may be no way to close it again. When we made a class trip to the northern islands of Germany and the Netherlands, none of us thought for a second that something truly terrible could happen. It was supposed to be educational, adventurous, and fun. The kind of trip schools organize to give students memories they'll talk about for years. We were young, surrounded by classmates and teachers, and we trusted that everything was planned and safe. Looking back now, that trust feels painfully naive. Part of the trip involved hiking across the mud flats between islands. At low tide, the sea pulls back and leaves behind vast stretches of wet sand and mud that look harmless, almost peaceful. Guides often talk about it like it's something special, something unique to experience. We were told to stay together, to follow instructions, and to be careful. At the time, it felt like enough. None of us truly understood how dangerous that place could become in a matter of minutes. We were walking in a group, laughing, talking, distracted like students usually are. Boots sinking slightly into the mud, the wind cold against our faces, the sky wide and open above us. Everything felt slow and quiet, almost calm. Then someone noticed something was wrong. 2 students were missing. At first, it didn't feel serious. People assumed they had just fallen behind, maybe stopped to look at something, maybe wandered a few steps off course. The teachers called out their names. We all started looking around, scanning the flat, empty landscape. There was nothing but mud, shallow water, and the distant sound of the sea. Then we heard screaming. It cut through everything, sharp, panicked, desperate. We turned toward the sound and saw them. The 2 students were far enough away that it already felt impossible to reach them. The water had started to move faster than anyone expected. Streams formed suddenly, pulling hard, like invisible hands dragging them away. The mud that looked solid moments before had turned into something that trapped and slowed movement. They were being pulled toward the open sea. Everything happened too fast. People shouted. Some tried to run, but the mud made it impossible to move quickly. Every step was heavy, slow, unsteady. You couldn't sprint. You could barely jog. By the time anyone realized just how bad it was, they were already too far away. There was nothing we could do. That's the part that stays with me the most. Not just that they drowned, but that we watched it happen and were completely powerless. No dramatic rescue attempt. No last-second miracle. Just screaming, rushing water, and then nothing. The sea took them because they made a few wrong steps on what was supposed to be a supervised class trip. Afterward, everything felt unreal. Shock settled over the group like a thick fog. People cried. Some stood completely silent, staring at the place where it had happened, as if their minds refused to accept it. Teachers looked broken. These were adults, responsible for our safety, and suddenly, they were facing something no training prepares you for. I still can't imagine what it must have been like for them afterward. How do you explain something like that to parents? How do you look someone in the eye and tell them their child went on a school trip and never came back? Not because of recklessness or violence, but because nature turned deadly in minutes. There are no words that make that easier, no explanation that brings comfort. And for their friends, the ones who stood there and watched, it leaves a scar that never fully fades. Knowing that someone you talked to earlier that day, someone who was laughing next to you, is suddenly gone forever. knowing it wasn't fate in some grand sense, but timing, geography, and a few steps in the wrong direction. That's what makes it so terrifying. Not monsters, not crime, not something you can clearly blame. Just the world being unforgiving. The realization that life can end suddenly, even when everything seems controlled and safe. Even when adults are present, even when rules are followed. I think about those two students often, about how ordinary that day must have felt to them before it went wrong, about how quickly fear replaced normality, and about the people who had to live with the memory of watching it happen. It changed the way I see trips like that. It changed the way I think about safety, about nature, about how thin the line really is between a normal day and a tragedy. Sometimes all it takes is a few wrong steps, and sometimes there's nothing anyone can do to stop what comes next. I present to you The Attack of the Dead Men, a moment from the First World War that sounds like a legend, but is rooted in real history and real human suffering. During World War I, the Germans set their sights on a Russian-held fortress in what is now Poland, known as Oswiecz Fortress. It was a stronghold guarding a vital route, and for months it had resisted repeated attacks. Eventually, the Germans decided to end the stalemate with overwhelming force. They brought 14 battalions against it, thousands of men. The Russians inside the fortress had fewer than 1,000 defenders left, many of them exhausted, undersupplied, and already wounded from earlier fighting. On paper, it wasn't even a contest. The outcome should have been inevitable. The German assault began with a massive artillery bombardment. Shells slammed into the fortress and the surrounding fields, tearing the earth apart, turning trenches into graves and shattering anything that still stood. Then came something far worse. The Germans released chlorine gas, one of the earliest chemical weapons used in the war. A thick, yellow-green cloud rolled across the battlefield and into the Russian positions. The gas burned everything it touched. Lungs filled with fluid, eyes blistered, skin was seared raw. The vegetation itself seemed to die. Grass blackened, leaves shriveled and turned yellow. The air became poison. The Russians had little protection. Some tried to cover their faces with cloth soaked in water or urine, but it was nowhere near enough. From the German perspective, the battle was already over. No one could survive that. After the bombardment and the gas attack ended, the Germans waited briefly, then prepared to advance. They believed they were about to walk into a silent, empty fortress, filled only with corpses. As the German infantry began their charge, moving through the smoke and gas, something unimaginable happened. From the dark, chlorine-soaked battlefield, figures began to rise. Not hundreds, not thousands. About 150 Russian soldiers emerged from the haze. These were men who should have been dead. Their uniforms were torn and stained. Their faces were burned and discolored by gas. Blood streamed from their mouths and noses. With every breath, fragments of their own lungs were being coughed out. Some of them had wrapped their faces in rags, now soaked through with blood and mucus. Others had nothing at all. They fixed their bayonets, and they charged. To the Germans advancing across that field, it must have looked like the dead themselves were coming for them. Half-blinded, choking, barely able to stand, these Russian soldiers ran forward anyway. Their eyes were wild. Their movements were uneven and desperate. They looked less like living men and more like something dragged back from the grave by sheer will. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The German soldiers froze. This was not something they had been prepared for. They had expected silence, maybe a few wounded survivors begging or crawling. Instead, they were confronted by what looked like a wave of corpses attacking them. Men coughing blood, screaming through ruined throats, advancing with bayonets as if pain no longer mattered. Fear spread faster than any command. The German line broke. Soldiers turned and ran, abandoning their advance, fleeing from the horror charging toward them. Discipline collapsed in seconds. What they ran into next only made it worse. In their panic, many Germans stumbled into their own barbed wire and defensive traps, obstacles they themselves had set up earlier that day. Men were caught, tangled, and cut down in the chaos. As they fled, Russian artillery from deeper positions opened fire. Shells crashed down among the retreating Germans, exploding in the smoke and confusion. The battlefield became a slaughterhouse of fire, gas, and terror. The attackers were being destroyed not just by the defenders, but by their own preparations and their own fear. The charge of those Russian soldiers did not retake the war. It did not change the course of the conflict, but in that moment it shattered the German assault completely. The fortress held, at least for a while longer. Those 150 men had nothing left to give. Many of them died shortly after, their bodies finally giving in to the damage done by the gas. Others were evacuated when the Russians eventually withdrew from the fortress, abandoning it only after it could no longer be defended. The Germans would capture Oswiecim in the end, but not that day, and not without being haunted by what they had seen. The image stayed with those who survived. Soldiers wrote about it, officers tried to explain it. How do you describe men who should be dead, charging out of poison clouds with blood pouring from their mouths, still fighting? How do you make sense of fear like that? That is why it became known as the Attack of the Dead Men. Not because they were zombies or demons, but because they were soldiers who refused to die quietly. Young men who, even as their bodies failed them, chose to stand up and run toward the enemy instead of lying down and waiting for death. In a war defined by industrial slaughter, this moment stood out as something almost mythic, a reminder of how far human beings can be pushed and what they can still do when there is nothing left to lose. When those men finally fell, their charge was over. The battlefield grew quiet again. The gas dispersed, the smoke lifted, and the dead, at last, were allowed to rest. But the memory of them never did. This happened a few years ago, but it still feels close whenever I think about it. At the time, my boyfriend and I weren't getting along very well. We had been arguing more than usual, and that night, things had escalated enough that he decided to leave the house and go hang out with some friends who lived just down the road. It wasn't unusual for him to do that when we needed space, so even though we were both upset, I didn't think much of it once he left. Our child was still very young then, and by that time of night, they were already asleep. It was late, probably around 10 or 11. The house was quiet in that heavy way it gets when everyone is asleep, and the outside world feels far away. I remember lying in bed, trying to calm myself down, replaying the argument in my head, wondering how we were going to fix things. The bed was positioned close to the front door, close enough that I could hear even small noises coming from that part of the house. At first, everything was normal. The usual sounds of the house settling, maybe a distant car passing by, nothing out of place. Then I heard the doorknob turn. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't something I could explain away as the wind or the house creaking. It was very clearly the sound of someone gripping the front doorknob and trying to turn it. Almost immediately after that, there was pressure against the door, like someone was pushing on it, testing it. The door didn't open because it was locked. The moment it happened, my entire body froze. I didn't sit up, I didn't move, I barely breathed. There was this overwhelming feeling that washed over me, something deeper than fear, telling me very clearly not to touch that door, not to get up, not to make noise, just stay exactly where I was. My mind started racing. My first thought was my boyfriend. Maybe he had come back for something. Maybe he forgot his keys. But that didn't make sense. His house keys were always on the same ring as his truck keys. He never went anywhere without them, and even if he had somehow forgotten them, I knew the way he knocked. This wasn't knocking. This was quiet, deliberate, like whoever it was didn't want to draw attention. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and called him. When he answered, he was irritated. We had just fought, and he clearly didn't want to hear from me. I could hear noise in the background, his friends talking. I asked him if he had his keys or if he had come back to the house. He snapped at me, asking what I was talking about. I tried to explain, but my voice was shaking so badly that I could barely get the words out. I told him someone had just tried to get into the house. The irritation in his voice disappeared instantly. He asked me if I was sure. I said yes. I told him I heard the doorknob turn and someone pushing on the door. I told him I was scared. I told him our child was asleep in the other room. He didn't ask any more questions. He just said they were on their way. From the time I hung up the phone to the moment headlights pulled into the driveway, it couldn't have been more than 30 seconds. Those 30 seconds felt endless. I lay there listening, straining to hear if the person was still outside. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't hear the door again. That silence was almost worse than the noise had been. My boyfriend and his friends came inside fast. They had flashlights. Between them, they had a couple of guns. They checked the front yard, the sides of the house, the back, everywhere. They shined lights into bushes down the road. Around the driveway, they found nothing. No one hiding, no signs of forced entry, no footprints that they could see, nothing at all. We called the police and filed a report. An officer came out, took our statement, and walked around the property. There wasn't much they could do without evidence. No damage to the door, no witnesses, no suspect. They told us they would keep an eye on the area. In the days that followed, we learned that similar reports had been made in nearby neighborhoods. Other people had called in about someone trying door handles late at night, someone testing locks, someone disappearing before they could be seen. Knowing that made my skin crawl. It meant this wasn't random. It wasn't someone mistaking our house for another. It was someone intentionally checking homes. What still haunts me the most is thinking about what would have happened if the door hadn't been locked, or if I had gotten up to open it, thinking it was my boyfriend. That thought makes my chest tighten even now. I don't want to know how different that night could have been. There's another detail that makes it even harder to think about. Less than a week before this happened, my boyfriend had boarded up the front door. The door itself was old. It had a wooden frame and 5 glass panels built into it. It looked nice, but it wasn't secure at all. Anyone could have broken through it easily if they wanted to. My boyfriend had mentioned it more than once, how unsafe it was. One day, almost casually, he decided to reinforce it. He boarded it up, making it solid, much harder to break through. At the time, I didn't think much of it. It felt unnecessary, even a little overprotective. Now, when I think back on it, it feels like timing that's too perfect to ignore. If that door hadn't been reinforced, I'm not sure it would have held. That night changed the way I feel in my own home. For a long time afterward, I double-checked the locks constantly. I slept lighter. Every sound made my heart race. I kept imagining that doorknob turning again, that quiet pressure against the door. I thought about how close danger had come without ever fully showing itself. What scared me wasn't seeing someone. It was not seeing them. The fact that someone was there, close enough to touch the door, close enough to get in if things had gone slightly differently, and then vanished without a trace. I still don't know who it was or what they wanted. I don't know if they were scared off by the locked door, or if they heard me moving inside, or if they simply moved on to the next house. I don't know, and I don't think I ever will. All I know is that something stopped me from opening that door. Whether it was instinct, fear, or something deeper, I listened to it. And because of that, My child slept through the night, and nothing worse happened. Sometimes the scariest moments aren't the ones where something happens. If you're still here, it means these stories didn't just pass through you, they stayed. Every story you heard tonight was real. Real people, real moments, and in every one of them, something went wrong, or almost did. If you want to keep exploring the stories that don't let go so easily, subscribe to Shadow Archives, because there are more stories waiting, and not all of them end before it's too late.